the hand connected with the stack of files she was holding. Not with her, not yet. It was a calculated act of violence by proxy, a strike meant to shatter her composure just as it scattered the pages across the sterile linoleum floor. The papers, filled with years of her life, her research, her future, fluttered down like dead leaves, settling in a chaotic halo around her worn leather shoes. Dr. Eris Thorne did not scream. She did not gasp. She simply watched them fall, a slow-motion confetti of her own methodical brilliance being desecrated in the harsh, fluorescent light of the hospital corridor. This was the end. She knew it with a clarity that was as cold and sharp as a scalpel. She had been leaving, quietly, carefully, planning her exit from Dr. Marcus Vance and the institution that had allowed him to eclipse her, but he had caught her. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was a low snarl, the polished charm he reserved for board members and wealthy patients stripped away to reveal the raw, possessive ugliness beneath. Eris finally looked up from the scattered remnants of her work. She looked at his face, the handsome, familiar features twisted into a mask of petulant rage. He had not updated the file. He was working from a version of her that had never been accurate, a version that was compliant, quiet, and easily intimidated. That version of her had been a carefully constructed fiction, a survival mechanism she had shed layer by layer over the past excruciating year. "I'm leaving, Marcus," she said. Her voice was steady. It surprised even her. It was the kind of steadiness that comes after the breaking point, when there is nothing left to lose. He laughed, a short, barking sound that held no humor. "Leaving? You're not going anywhere. You have an obligation. To me. To this hospital." He gestured vaguely at the walls, as if they were his personal property. He took a step closer, his expensive Italian shoes scuffing one of her research papers. It was a diagram of the Thorne procedure, a revolutionary cardiothoracic technique she had developed, the one he was scheduled to present in Vienna next month as his own. "Sign the papers, Aries." He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. The non-disclosure agreement. The one that would legally muzzle her, signing over all intellectual property rights for everything she had accomplished here. It was her entire career, her name, her soul, condensed into 10 pages of legalese. "Sign it, and we can forget this little tantrum. You can have your old lab back. I'll even let you assist me in Vienna." The offer was so galling, so deeply insulting, it was almost absurd. Let her assist in the presentation of her own groundbreaking work. He truly saw her as nothing more than an accessory to his ambition. She looked at his outstretched hand, at the pen he was trying to force on her. She did not take it. No. The word was small, but it landed in the silent corridor with the weight of an anchor. It was a complete sentence, a final verdict. His face darkened. The veneer of control cracked completely. "No?" He lunged forward, his hand clamping around her upper arm, fingers digging into the muscle with bruising force. "You don't get to say no to me." The pain was sharp, a sudden flare that shot up to her shoulder, but it was the humiliation that truly burned. They were in a public space, albeit a deserted one late at night. A young nurse, a new hire named Chloe, had just rounded the far corner and frozen, her eyes wide with alarm. Marcus didn't even notice her. His world had narrowed to this single point of conflict, this final assertion of his dominance. "Let go of my arm, Marcus," Eris said again, her voice still unnervingly calm. She was looking at his hand on her arm, a clinical, detached observation. The pressure was constricting blood flow. Her fingers would start to tingle in another minute. "You will sign this," he hissed, shaking her slightly. "You owe me. Everything you are is because of me." It was in that moment, as the lie hung in the air, thick and suffocating, that another sound entered the space. It was not a loud sound. It was the quiet, deliberate clink of a heavy glass being set down on a marble-topped table. It came from an alcove in the waiting area, a space she had thought was empty. shrouded in the dim, tasteful lighting reserved for VIP donors. The sound cut through Marcus's rage-filled monologue like a razor. He stopped, turning his head, annoyed by the interruption. A figure emerged from the shadows. He did not rush. He was not performing. He moved with an unhurried grace that seemed to bend the very atmosphere of the hallway around him. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. His hair was black, his features sharp and placid. He was Julian Kang, the man whose name was whispered in tones of reverence and fear throughout the hospital, the silent, almost mythical benefactor who had funded the entire new cardiac wing, the very building they were standing in. The air in the corridor changed. It was a palpable shift, as if the barometric pressure had suddenly dropped. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to fade. The distant beep of a monitor felt miles away. Chloe, the young nurse, was no longer just standing there. She was utterly still, a statue of terrified respect. Marcus's grip on Eris's arm loosened, not from a conscious decision, but from pure, reflexive shock. He had never met the man, only seen pictures. Julian Kang stopped a few feet away. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered from Marcus's face, down to the hand still gripping Eris's arm, and then, finally, to Eris's face. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that gaze, Eris felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt seen, not as a possession, not as a subordinate, not as a problem, but as a person. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he spoke, the words were low and resonant, steady as iron wrapped in silk. Let go of her arm. It was not a request. It was a statement of what was about to happen. Marcus, flustered and arrogant, puffed up his chest. He was still operating on the assumption of his own importance. I'm sorry, do you know who I am? This is a private matter between my fiancé and me. Julian Kang's expression did not change. Not a single muscle in his face moved, but a coldness entered his eyes, a deep Arctic chill that made the air feel thin. He took another slow step forward. I know exactly who you are, Dr. Vance, he said, his voice still quiet, yet it seemed to fill the entire space. You are the head of a department in a hospital I own. You are standing in a wing I paid for, and you are assaulting the one doctor whose work justifies its existence. He paused, letting the words sink in, each one a perfectly placed stone building a wall around Marcus. So, for the last time, let go. Marcus's hand flew back from Eris's arm as if he'd been burned. The sudden release made her stumble, but she caught herself, rubbing the angry red marks his fingers had left behind. Marcus stared, his mouth slightly agape. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted in the space of 30 seconds. He was no longer the master of this domain. He was a trespasser. Julian Kang's gaze did not waver from Marcus's face. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand. From the shadows near the elevator bank, 2 men appeared. They were built like refrigerators, dressed in the same dark, impeccably tailored suits as Julian. They moved with a silent, fluid efficiency that spoke of years of training. They were not hospital security. They were something else entirely. Remove him from the building, Julian said, his voice dropping even lower, now a private command. And inform the board that his position has been terminated, effective immediately. You can't do that, Marcus sputtered, his face a mottled mess of red and white. Panic was beginning to seep through the cracks in his arrogance. Julian finally turned his head, giving Marcus the smallest fraction of his attention. I can, he said, the words utterly devoid of emotion. I already have. He turned his back on Marcus then, a dismissal more profound than any insult. One of the large men placed a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus tried to shake it off, but it was like trying to shrug off a granite slab. The second man began methodically picking up the scattered papers from the floor, his movements precise and respectful. As they began to guide the sputtering, protesting doctor away, Marcus yelled one last thing down the corridor. "Eris, you'll regret this! You're nothing without me!" The words echoed, pathetic and hollow, until the sound was cut off by the quiet swoosh of the closing elevator doors. And then there was silence. The kind of silence that doesn't echo. The kind that settles. The second man finished gathering the papers, stacking them into a neat pile. He approached Julian, holding them out. Julian did not take them. He nodded toward Aris. The man turned and offered the stack to her. She took them, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the papers to her chest. Her work. Her life. Rescued from the floor. She looked at Julian Kang, who was still watching her with that same unnerving, placid intensity. The adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a tremor she couldn't control. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt inadequate. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Are you injured, Dr. Thorne?" he asked. His use of her formal title was a small, sharp act of respect that felt like a balm on a raw wound. "No, I'm fine." It was an automatic response, the lie of a woman long accustomed to minimizing her own pain. He looked pointedly at the red marks blooming on her arm. He did not call her a liar. He simply let the evidence speak for itself. He glanced at the young nurse, Chloe, who was still frozen by the far wall. "Please get Dr. Thorne a glass of water and find her coat." Chloe unfroze instantly, scurrying off to do his bidding as if she'd been given a royal decree. Eris clutched her papers tighter. "You didn't have to do that." "Marcus Vance was a liability I had been meaning to deal with," he replied, his tone matter of fact. He was inefficient, his results were inconsistent, and his ambition outweighed his talent. Tonight, he simply accelerated the timeline. He made it sound like a simple business decision, a line item on a balance sheet, but his eyes told a different story. The coldness was still there, a banked fire waiting for a target. Chloe returned with a bottle of water and Eris's long wool coat. Eris took the water, her fingers fumbling with the cap. Julian took it from her gently, twisted it open with an effortless motion, and handed it back. The brief touch of his fingers against hers was cool and dry. It grounded her. "Come," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'll take you home." "You don't need to." She started to protest, the habit of refusing help dying hard. "I am aware of what I need to do, Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice soft but absolute. He gestured toward the private elevator, the one that went directly to the VIP garage. "My car is waiting." She looked from his calm, implacable face to the corridor where Marcus had just been dragged away, to the papers clutched in her hand. Her apartment, the one she had shared with Marcus, was no longer a safe place to go. Her meticulously planned escape had been blown apart, but in its place, something else had appeared. A force she didn't understand, an offer of safety from the most unexpected source imaginable. She was too tired to fight, too shaken to argue. For the first time in a very long time, she let someone else take control. She gave a small, weary nod and walked with him toward the elevator. The doors slid open, revealing a cabin of polished mahogany and brass. As they closed, sealing them inside, she felt the last 5 years of her life fall away, leaving her standing on a terrifying, uncertain, but undeniably new threshold. The inside of the car was like the inside of a vault. The city noise vanished the moment the heavy door clicked shut, replaced by a deep, insulated quiet. The air smelled of clean leather and something else, something subtle and expensive that Eris couldn't name. It was the scent of a world entirely different from her own. She sat on the plush seat, her coat folded on her lap, the stack of papers held tightly in her hands like a shield. Julian sat opposite her, not beside her, a gesture of respect for her space that she noted with a distant part of her mind. He hadn't spoken since they left the hospital. He simply sat, perfectly still, watching the rain-streaked lights of the city slide past the tinted window. His stillness was not empty. It was watchful, patient. It was the stillness of a predator, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was on the safe side of the cage. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and even. "Where would you like to go, Dr. Thorne?" The question hung in the quiet car. Where? The apartment she had shared with Marcus was compromised. Her few friends in the city lived in small places, and she couldn't bear the thought of bringing this chaos to their doorsteps. She had no family nearby. She was an island. I I don't know, she admitted, the words tasting like failure. He did not seem surprised. He seemed to have anticipated it. "I have a place you can use. It is secure. It is private. You would not be disturbed." Her first instinct was to refuse. The reflex was deeply ingrained. Don't accept help. Don't be a burden. Don't be indebted. "I couldn't possibly." "Why not?" he asked, a genuine, curious question. "Because we don't know each other. Because you've already done more than enough." "Because—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the complex knot of pride, fear, and bone-deep weariness inside her. "We don't know each other," he repeated softly. "That is not entirely accurate." He reached into the seat back pocket in front of him and pulled out a slim tablet. He touched the screen, and it illuminated his face in a cool blue light. He swiveled it to face her. On the screen was an article from a small, prestigious medical journal, published 3 years ago. The title was "A Novel Approach to Mitral Valve Repair Using Bio-Integrated Polymers." The author was listed as Eris Thorne, MD. It was her first major publication, a piece of work she was immensely proud of, one that Marcus had dismissed as academically interesting but commercially irrelevant. Julian swiped the screen. Another article appeared, this one from 18 months ago. Then another and another, a portfolio of her work, her ideas, her mind, laid out in digital black and white. Finally, he stopped on the last image. It was a grant proposal, a highly technical document outlining the foundational theory for what would become the Thorne procedure. It was dated 2 years ago. It was the document Marcus had taken, reframed, and claimed as his own. "I have been following your work for some time, Dr. Thorne," Julian said, his eyes meeting hers over the top of the screen. "When my foundation was looking to make a significant investment in cardiac medicine, it was your research that caught my attention, not the hospital's reputation, not the board's proposals, yours." He paused. "The Thorne Kang cardiac wing was built for you. I was simply waiting for the right time to introduce myself." Eris stared at him. The information was too large to process. The benefactor, the silent partner. The man whose name was a legend in the hospital was not just some random billionaire. He had seen her. He had seen her work, sought it out, and valued it enough to build a legacy on it. While Marcus was dismissing her, belittling her, and stealing from her, this quiet, powerful man in the shadows had been reading her papers and betting millions on her intellect. The disorientation was dizzying. It was like learning the sun and moon were not what you thought they were. "Marcus," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He told everyone it was his project." "Mr. Vance is very good at taking credit," Julian said without inflection. "It is perhaps his only true talent. I allowed him to believe he had secured the funding. It was expedient. It allowed me to observe the department's internal dynamics. And to observe you." "Observe me?" The phrase sent a small shiver down her spine. It sounded predatory, but his tone was clinical, detached. "I do not invest in projects, Dr. Thorne. I invest in people. I needed to be certain of the person behind the research." He leaned forward slightly. "Your work is not just brilliant. It is elegant. It is compassionate. You design procedures that consider not just the mechanical function of the organ, but the recovery of the human being it belongs to. That is a rare quality." He was describing her own philosophy back to her, principles she had never even articulated aloud to anyone. He saw the intention behind the data, the heart behind the science. The wave of emotion that washed over her was so strong it almost buckled her. It was the disorienting, terrifying, overwhelming relief of being truly, deeply understood. Tears she had refused to shed in front of Marcus now pricked at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. He saw it. Of course, he saw it. He leaned back, giving her space again. The offer of a place to stay is not charity. It is an asset protection strategy. You are the most valuable part of my investment. Leaving you unprotected would be fiscally irresponsible. Framing it in cold corporate terms was a gift. It allowed her pride to accept what her heart desperately needed. It gave her an out. She wasn't a victim being rescued. She was an asset being secured. She could work with that. "Okay," she said, her voice small but firm. "Thank you." He simply nodded, then pressed a button on an intercom. "Lena, we are going to the Obsidian." "Yes, Mr. Kang." A crisp, female voice replied instantly. The driver, separated from them by a pane of dark glass, expertly navigated a turn, and the car sped smoothly into the night, carrying her away from the ruins of her old life and toward something utterly unknown. The Obsidian was not an apartment building. It was a statement, a sleek black tower that pierced the sky, its upper floors disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. The car bypassed the main entrance, descending into a private subterranean garage that felt more like a showroom. The driver pulled into a designated spot next to a black sports car that looked more like a stealth fighter jet. A woman was waiting for them. She was sharp and severe in a pencil skirt and a silk blouse, her tablet held at the ready. This had to be Lena. She radiated an aura of terrifying competence. "Mr. Kang," she said, her eyes flicking to Aris for a fraction of a second, an assessment so quick it was barely there. "Apartment 72 is prepared. I've had a few essentials delivered, clothing, toiletries. We can arrange for a more complete wardrobe tomorrow. The legal team is on standby, and I have already filed a temporary restraining order against Marcus Vance on Dr. Thorne's behalf, effective at 6 a.m. Eris blinked. It was all happening so fast, a whirlwind of efficiency she could barely track. "Thank you, Lena," Julian said. He turned to Aris. "Lena is my chief of staff. If you require anything at all, she will acquire it." Lena gave a curt, professional nod to Eris. "Dr. Thorne, it is a pleasure to finally meet you. I am a great admirer of your paper on polymer elasticity." Eris was floored. The terrifyingly competent chief of staff had also read her work. What kind of world had she just stepped into? "Oh, thank you," she managed to say. Julian led her to a private elevator. He pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner and the doors slid open. Inside, there was only one button, a simple, elegant 72. The ride-up was silent and impossibly fast. When the doors opened again, they opened directly into a living room. Eris stepped out and stopped, speechless. The apartment was a cavern of glass and minimalist design. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering sprawl of the city. The furniture was sparse but beautiful, a low-slung gray sofa, a single Eames chair, a dark wood table. There was no clutter, no personal effects. It was a perfect, sterile, beautiful space, a gilded cage. She didn't know what to say. "Sufficient for now," Julian finished for her. He walked over to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "It has its own security detail, and no one can access this floor without my authorization. You will be safe here." He turned back to her. "I have a proposition for you, Dr. Thorne. Beyond a place to stay." He gestured to the sprawling city below them. "The Thorne Kang cardiac wing is the hardware. It is an empty vessel. It requires software. It requires a mind to run it. I am not offering you a job. A job implies you work for someone. I am offering you a platform, an institute, your own research facility, funded for the next 10 years with full autonomy. Your name on the door, your vision, your rules." Eris felt her knees go weak. She sank down onto the edge of the sofa, the stack of her research papers still clutched in her hands. This was beyond anything she had ever dared to dream. In her wildest fantasies of escaping Marcus, she had imagined a small lab at a lesser-known university, a quiet life where she could simply do her work in peace. He was offering her a kingdom. Why? She asked, the single word encompassing 1,000 questions. Why me? Why this? What's the catch? He walked over and stood before her, looking down at her, his expression unreadable as ever. Because I have spent my life building and acquiring things, Dr. Thorne, companies, properties, technologies, all of them are, in the end, just things. They are hollow. Your work is not. It has the potential to save lives, to change the very definition of what is possible. Of all my assets, he said, the word clinical and precise, you are the one I believe will yield the greatest return. Not in dollars, but in legacy. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single slim business card. He placed it on the stack of papers in her lap. It was heavy, black cardstock with a name and a number embossed in silver, Julian Kang, and a private number. Rest, he said. Lena has stocked the kitchen. My legal team will contact you in the morning to begin the process of formally separating your intellectual property from the hospital and from Mr. Vance. We will be thorough. We will be aggressive. He will be left with nothing that is not his, which is to say, he will be left with nothing. The finality in his voice was absolute. He turned and walked to the elevator. His hand hovered over the biometric panel. He paused. Dr. Thorne, he said without turning around. One more thing. You are not working for me. You are not indebted to me. We are now partners. I would ask that you remember that. The elevator doors slid shut, and he was gone. Eris was left alone in the vast, silent apartment. The lights of the city spread out before her like a fallen constellation. She looked down at the business card sitting atop her life's work. A partnership. It was a terrifying, exhilarating thought. She slowly uncurled her fingers, which had been clenched so tightly around her papers that they ached. She took a deep, shuddering breath. It was the first breath she had taken all night that didn't feel like it was being stolen from her. The air was thin up here, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. The first few days were a study in disorientation. Aris woke up each morning in a bed that felt like a cloud, to a sunrise that painted the city in hues of rose and gold. The silence of the apartment was the most jarring thing. For years, her life had been noise, the constant, frantic beeping of hospital machinery, the demanding tone of Marcus's voice, the loud static of her own anxiety. Here, there was only the gentle hum of the climate control system and the distant, muted sigh of the city far below. It was the kind of silence that lets you hear yourself think. She spent hours just sitting in the Eames chair, staring out at the view, processing the seismic shift in her reality. She thought about the look on Marcus's face as he was dragged away, not because he was sorry, but because he was caught. She thought about Julian Kang's quiet, devastating power, the way he had dismantled her crisis with the calm precision of a surgeon excising a tumor. He had not performed. He had simply acted. It was a display of power so profound it was almost invisible, the opposite of Marcus's hollow, performed dominance. Lena was her only point of contact. The woman was a marvel of efficiency. Every morning, a single encrypted email would be in Eris's inbox. Good morning, Dr. Thorne. The preliminary injunction against Mr. Vance has been granted. His access to all hospital facilities and records is now legally blocked. A courier will arrive at 10 a.m. with the draft contracts for the Kang-Thorne Institute. Please review at your leisure. A car is available for you should you require it. The messages were always signed simply L. When the contracts arrived, Eris spread them out on the large dining table. It was a formidable stack of paper, but she was not intimidated. She was a researcher. She knew how to parse dense material. She spent the next 2 days with a red pen, reading every line. The terms were, as Julian had promised, astonishingly generous. Full funding, complete autonomy, intellectual property rights vested entirely in her name. But she found things to change. A clause here about reporting structure that she felt was too vague. A line there about advisory board appointments that she wanted more control over. She was not a damsel being given a castle. She was, as he had said, a partner. And a partner had input. She filled the margins with precise, intelligent notes. She redlined entire sections, suggesting alternative language. It was her way of asserting her independence, of reminding herself and him that she was not a passive recipient of his largesse. She was an active participant in the creation of her own future. When she was done, she scanned the marked-up pages and sent them back to Lena with a simple message. "My notes are attached. Please forward them to Mr. Kang." That evening, as she was staring out the window, watching the city lights begin to glitter, the private elevator chimed. Her heart gave a small jolt. The doors opened, and Julian Kang stepped out. He was holding a copy of her marked-up contract. He didn't speak at first. He walked over to the table and looked down at her red-inked revisions. He picked up a page, studying her notes. Eris held her breath, unsure of what to expect. Annoyance? Impatience? He finally looked up at her, and there was something new in his eyes. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing she had seen to it. It was a flicker of deep, genuine respect. "Excellent notes, Dr. Thorne," he said. "Your proposed changes to Section 4B regarding intellectual property derivatives are particularly astute. My legal team missed that nuance." Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. "I wanted to be clear on the terms," she said, her voice steady. "Clarity is always appreciated," he said. "I have already instructed Lena to have the documents redrafted to incorporate all of your suggestions." He placed the papers back on the table. "Is there anything else you require?" "I need my books," she said, the request sudden and practical. "My personal research library. It's still at the apartment." The apartment she had shared with Marcus. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That can be arranged. Lena will coordinate with your building's management to have your belongings packed and moved. You will not need to go there yourself." "I don't leave because things become complicated, Mr. Kang," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "I need to get them myself. There are notes, papers tucked inside them. Things a moving company wouldn't understand. It was a boundary, a small one, but an important one, a statement that she would not be handled, even for her own safety." He considered her for a long moment. She expected him to argue, to insist. Instead, he simply nodded. "Very well, I will accompany you." "That isn't necessary." "It is," he said, the tone brokering no argument. "We will go tomorrow morning." The next day, she found herself back in the silent, leather-scented interior of his car, pulling up to the curb of her old building. It looked smaller, shabbier than she remembered. Julian's presence next to her was a solid, reassuring weight. Two of his silent, suit-clad men stood discreetly by the entrance. As they walked into the lobby, the doorman, a man who had always been curt and dismissive to her, practically tripped over himself to hold the door, his eyes wide with awe at the sight of Julian Kang. It was a small, bitter taste of the power that now surrounded her. The apartment was just as she had left it. A ghost of Marcus's expensive, cloying cologne still hung in the air. Julian did not enter right away. He stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the space with a blank, assessing gaze, as if checking for threats. Eris walked directly to the study. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with the texts that had been her companions and teachers for over a decade. She began to pull them down, stacking them carefully into the boxes Lena had sent up. Julian remained in the doorway, a silent, watchful guardian. He did not offer to help. He seemed to understand that this was something she needed to do herself, a reclamation of her own intellectual space. As she was pulling a heavy copy of Gray's Anatomy from a high shelf, a small, folded piece of paper fluttered out from between the pages. She picked it up. It was a photograph, her and her parents, on the day she graduated from medical school. Her father, a gruff, proud man who had passed away 2 years ago, had his arm around her. Her mother was beaming. It was from a lifetime ago. She was staring at the photo when a shadow fell over her. Julian had moved from the doorway and was standing a few feet behind her. "My father," she said, her voice thick. "He was a general practitioner in a small town. He's the reason I became a doctor." Julian looked at the photo, then at her. "He would be proud of you." It was a simple statement, but it struck her with the force of a physical blow. Marcus had always been dismissive of her father, calling him a country doctor. To hear this man, this titan of industry, speak of him with such simple, profound respect was everything. The tears she had been holding back for days finally fell. She didn't sob. They just slid silently down her cheeks. He did not move to comfort her. He did not touch her. He simply stood there, a quiet, solid presence, allowing her the dignity of her grief. He was giving her the one thing no one else ever had, the space to be vulnerable without being weak. In that moment, something shifted between them. The relationship, which had been defined by crisis and contract, now had a new, fragile layer. It was the beginning of a connection that had nothing to do with money or power, and everything to do with two lonely, serious people recognizing a kindred spirit in each other. He was not just her protector, he was becoming her witness. Meanwhile, in a far less elegant part of the city, Marcus Vance was learning the true meaning of the word consequence. His suspension had become a termination. His hospital privileges were revoked. His access cards were deactivated. When he tried to log into his research server, a message popped up. Access denied. He was furious. He spent his days firing off angry emails to the hospital board, all of which went unanswered. He called former colleagues who suddenly became very busy, their voices strained and distant. The world that had once revolved around him was now treating him like a ghost. His arrogance, however, remained intact. It was the central pillar of his personality. He couldn't conceive of a world where he didn't win. He saw Julian Kang not as a sovereign power, but as a rival, a rich amateur who had been seduced by Eris. He's just some infatuated billionaire, Marcus told his lawyer, a slick, overpriced man who was beginning to look nervous. She's played him. Give her 3 days without my name to back her up and she'll come crawling back. We just need to apply pressure. His lawyer cleared his throat. Marcus, the restraining order is quite comprehensive, and the initial filings from Kang's legal team are formidable. They are claiming full intellectual property rights for Dr. Thorne on everything developed in the last 4 years. That's my work! Marcus slammed his fist on the table. She was my junior fellow, my fiancée. She has an obligation. The paper trail they've provided is extensive, the lawyer said carefully. Early drafts, grant proposals, lab notes, all in her name, all predating your involvement. Marcus waved a dismissive hand. Details. We'll bury them in paperwork. File a countersuit. Claim emotional distress. Claim she stole the work from me. We'll make it messy. He's a businessman. He'll hate messy. He'll pay to make it go away. He was completely misreading the situation. He thought he was in a legal battle. He didn't understand he was in a war, and his opponent was not a lawyer, but a general who had already positioned all his pieces for checkmate. The first real blow came a week later. The prestigious journal that was set to publish his, Eris's, paper on the Thorne procedure abruptly pulled the article. When Marcus called his editor in a rage, the man's voice was hollow. My hands are tied, Marcus. We were acquired. Last Tuesday. Acquired? By who? A holding company, K Global Industries. Kang. The name hit him like a physical shock. He hadn't just intervened at the hospital. He was buying the very ground beneath Marcus's feet. The second blow followed quickly. A formal investigation was launched by the National Institutes of Health into his grant funding, citing anonymous but credible allegations of data falsification. His assets were frozen pending the outcome. He was radioactive. Still, his delusion held. He saw it all as a campaign of intimidation that he could overcome with one bold move. He learned through a former colleague, one he had to bribe for the information, that Eris was scheduled to be the keynote speaker at the annual Obsidian Gala, the city's most exclusive medical foundation fundraiser. A slow, venomous smile spread across his face. This was it, his chance. He would confront her publicly, in front of the entire medical establishment. He would expose her as a fraud and a thief. He would reclaim his narrative, his work, his life. He still had a few favors he could call in, an old medical school acquaintance on the gala's organizing committee. He could get a ticket. He imagined the scene. Heiress on stage, basking in her stolen glory. He would stride up, take the microphone, and tell the world the truth. They would have to listen. They would see him as the wronged party, the brilliant mind betrayed. They would see her for the social climbing manipulator she was. It was a perfect plan. He had no idea that the Obsidian Gala was not just any event. It was the flagship charity of the Kang Family Foundation. He was not planning to crash a party. He was planning to walk, willingly and with supreme confidence, directly into the lion's mouth. And Julian Kang, who was CC'd on every internal gala security email, knew he was coming. The trap was not being set. It had been waiting for him all along. The Obsidian Gala was an exercise in performative power. It was held in a soaring, cathedral-like space at the top of the city's Contemporary Art Museum, a building Julian Kang also owned. The air shimmered with wealth, a heady perfume of money, influence, and ambition. Men in bespoke tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than a car drifted through the room, their laughter tinkling like carefully orchestrated wind chimes. Eris stood in the wings, just off the main stage, holding a small note card she didn't need. She was not nervous. The woman who had trembled in a hospital corridor felt like a distant memory. Tonight, she wore an emerald green gown, a column of silk that was both elegant and severe. It had been Lena's choice. A color of growth and stability, the woman had stated, as if discussing a stock portfolio. Julian appeared at her side, a silent materialization. He was in a black tuxedo that made him look even taller, more formidable. He held 2 flutes of champagne. He offered one to her. "You are ready?" he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," she replied, taking the glass. The crystal was cool against her fingers. "Are you?" He looked out at the glittering crowd, his face impassive. "Everything is in its correct place." It was an odd phrase, but she was beginning to understand how his mind worked. He saw the world as a complex system, and he was a master at arranging its components to achieve a desired outcome. "He's here," she said. She hadn't seen Marcus, but she could feel his presence, a discordant note in the symphony of the evening. "He is," Julian confirmed, his gaze sweeping the room. "He believes he is the protagonist of this story. It is a common failing among men of his particular archetype." A small smile touched Eris's lips. "And what archetype is that?" "The temporary," he said simply. He took a sip of his champagne. "It is time." A man with a headset gave her a thumbs up. Eris handed her untouched champagne flute back to Julian. Their fingers brushed. This time, his skin was not cool. It was warm. She walked onto the stage to a wave of polite applause. The lights were bright, but not blinding. She saw hundreds of faces, the most powerful people in medicine and finance, all looking at her. She stepped up to the lectern, and a sudden, profound calm settled over her. This was her element. She began to speak. She didn't talk about Marcus. She didn't talk about the drama or the theft. She talked about the work. She spoke of the elegant, intricate dance of a living heart. She explained her procedure not with dry data, but with a passion that was captivating. She made them see the beauty in a perfectly executed suture, the poetry in the restoration of blood flow. She was not just a scientist, she was an artist, and the human heart was her canvas. The room was utterly silent, captivated. When she finished, there was a beat of stunned silence, and then the applause began. It wasn't polite, it was a roar, a standing ovation. It was into this moment of pure triumph that Marcus Vance chose to make his move. He burst from the side of the room, pushing past a security guard who seemed to offer only token resistance. He was disheveled, his tuxedo wrinkled, his face flushed with a desperate, manic energy. He stormed the stage, his eyes wild. "She's a fraud!" he shouted, his voice cracking. He lunged for the microphone at the lectern, shoving Aris aside. She stumbled but caught herself, her calm unwavering. She simply took a step back, her face a mask of cold neutrality. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. The applause died instantly. Marcus gripped the lectern, his knuckles white. "This is my work! She stole it from me!" he yelled into the microphone. "Every word she just said, every slide in that presentation, it's mine! She was my protégée, my fiancée. She has an obligation to me. She is nothing but an ungrateful social climbing thief." He was panting, his chest heaving. He looked out at the sea of shocked faces, a triumphant, crazed glint in his eye. He thought he was winning. He thought this was his moment of vindication. He did not see Julian Kang walk calmly to a second, smaller lectern at the other side of the stage. Julian didn't run. He didn't shout. He waited for a technician to hand him a live microphone, and then he waited for the murmuring in the room to die down, which it did almost immediately. All eyes turned to him. "Good evening," Julian said, his voice low and perfectly amplified, cutting through the tense atmosphere. "It seems we have an unscheduled addition to our program." He looked at Marcus with a detached, almost pitying expression. "Mr. Vance, you have made several claims. Let us examine them." He pulled his phone from his pocket. It was a simple, elegant gesture. Behind him, the massive screen that had just shown Eris's presentation flickered to life. It now showed a live, crystal-clear feed of Julian's phone screen. "You claim Dr. Thorne's work is yours," Julian said, his voice a calm, steady narrative. "This is a document filed 3 years ago, a grant proposal submitted by Dr. Thorne for a project she called Bio-Integrated Valvular Reconstruction. As you can see, your name appears nowhere on it." An image of the document filled the 50-foot screen. You claim she has an obligation to you and to the hospital," Julian continued, his thumb swiping on his phone. "This, however, is the ownership deed for St. Michael's Medical Center. As you can see, it was purchased 6 weeks ago by K Global Industries, a subsidiary of my family's foundation. So any obligation she might have had is, in fact, to me, and I have released her from it." The deed, with its official seals and signatures, filled the screen. A wave of shock rippled through the audience. "You submitted a paper based on Dr. Thorne's work to the New England Journal of Surgical Innovation," Julian went on, his voice relentlessly calm. "A fine publication. I was so impressed by its reputation that I had my foundation acquire its parent media company last month. Your article was, of course, rejected. A new document appeared. A record of acquisition. Marcus's face had gone from flushed red to a pasty, sickly white. His mouth hung open. He looked from the giant screen to Julian, his mind visibly failing to process the scale of his own destruction. "You speak of obligations," Julian said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal. "Let's speak of yours. For the last 2 years, you have been a paid consultant for MedTech Solutions and Cardiovascular Dynamics, 2 leading medical device companies." He paused. "They were also acquired by me. Your consulting contracts are terminated." Another swipe. 2 more documents of acquisition. The audience was no longer just watching, they were witnessing an execution. "Finally," Julian said, his voice now holding a razor's edge of cold fury. "The core of your claim is that you are the true innovator. But innovation requires work. It requires data. And your data has always been problematic." The image on the screen changed. It was now a video. A young, terrified-looking researcher, a junior fellow from Marcus's own lab, was looking into the camera. It was a pre-recorded, legally notarized deposition. "Dr. Vance," the young man on the screen stammered, "he made me change the numbers. The mortality rates for the early trials, they were higher than he reported. He told me if I didn't alter the data, my career would be over." The video played on, a quiet, damning confession of academic fraud laid bare for the entire world to see. Marcus made a strange, strangled sound in the back of his throat. He stared at the screen, at the face of the young man he had bullied into submission, and the last vestiges of his arrogance finally, completely, shattered. Julian swiped the screen one last time, and the video vanished, replaced by a simple, stark message in white text on a black background. "Access denied." You have been working from an outdated file, Dr. Vance," Julian said, his quiet voice delivering the final blow. A version of the world where you held power, where your actions had no consequences, where Dr. Thorne was your possession. But that world no longer exists. Your access has been revoked. Marcus Vance did not shout. He did not protest. He simply collapsed. It was not a dramatic, theatrical fall. He crumpled, his body folding in on itself as if his bones had turned to dust. He landed on the stage in a heap of wrinkled tuxedo and broken pride. A low, wretched, sobbing sound began to emanate from him, the sound of a man who had lost everything in the space of 5 minutes. 2 of Julian's security men materialized on stage. They moved with their usual quiet efficiency, lifting the sobbing, unresisting Marcus to his feet. They did not drag him. They supported him, guiding his boneless form off the stage and toward a side exit where, Eris knew, uniformed police officers would be waiting. The antagonist was not just ruined, he was erased. A profound, stunned silence held the room in its grip. Julian Kang stood at his lectern, his phone now back in his pocket. He looked at the audience, then he turned and looked at Aris. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he walked back to the main lectern, the one Marcus had desecrated. He adjusted the microphone. "My apologies for the interruption," he said, as if they had just returned from a brief intermission. He gestured toward Aris, who was still standing, poised and silent on the stage. "Allow me to reintroduce the woman you came to hear tonight. Not as a protege, not as a subordinate, but as the sole architect of the Thorne procedure and the founding head of the new Kang Thorne Institute for Advanced Cardiac Research." He turned to Aris, his expression now clear of all its earlier coldness, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. "Dr. Thorne." He began to applaud, not loudly, but with a slow, deliberate cadence. For a second, the room remained silent, still processing the brutal spectacle they had just witnessed. Then, one by one, then in dozens, then in hundreds, they joined him. The applause started as a ripple and grew into a tidal wave of sound washing over the stage. It was thunderous. It was genuine. It was for her. And in that moment, standing in the bright, warm light, Eris Thorne was not just vindicated. She was reborn. Later, the noise of the gala had faded to a distant, pleasant hum. Eris stood on a private terrace adjoining the main hall, a cool night breeze stirring the silk of her gown. The city spread out before her, a breathtaking tapestry of light and shadow. She felt quiet. The years of tension that had lived in her shoulders and the back of her neck had finally dissolved. She took a slow breath, a full, deep inhale that reached all the way to the bottom of her lungs. It felt like the first real breath of her life. Julian came to stand beside her. He did not speak, simply leaned against the railing, his presence a solid, comforting anchor in the vastness of the night. For a long time, they just stood in shared silence, watching the endless stream of headlights on the distant freeways. "He will face federal charges for fraud," Julian said finally, his voice low. "In addition to the civil suits my foundation is filing on your behalf. He will lose his medical license. He will likely serve time in prison. It is handled." Eris nodded, looking out at the horizon. The satisfaction she thought she would feel at Marcus's downfall wasn't there. There was no joy, no triumph, just a quiet, hollow emptiness where the fight used to be. It was the feeling of a limb being amputated. The sickness was gone, but the space it occupied was now a phantom ache. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." "I told you, Dr. Thorne," he replied, turning to look at her. "We are partners. Partners protect each other's interests." A real smile, the first one she could remember in years, touched her lips. It felt foreign and wonderful. "Eris," she said. "My name is Eris." A corresponding warmth flickered in his dark eyes. "Julian," he said. It was a new beginning, stripped down to its most essential elements. Just their names, spoken in the quiet of a city night. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a small, flat velvet box. For a heart-stopping second, she thought it was a ring, and a wave of panic and disappointment washed over her. But he simply opened it and held it out. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was not a piece of jewelry. It was a single, elegantly crafted keycard. It was black metal, heavy and cool, with the letters KTI etched in silver. The Kangthorne Institute. "The labs are finished," he said. "The staff has been hired. I took the liberty of poaching the best people from St. Michael's, including a very enthusiastic young nurse named Chloe, whom I believe you've met. The doors open on Monday. This is yours." She reached out and took the keycard. It felt heavy in her palm, a tangible piece of her future. It was not a gift he was giving her. It was a responsibility he was entrusting her with. It was better than any jewel. It was a key to her own life. She closed her fingers around it, the cool metal warming to her touch. She looked from the key to the city, and then to him. His face was calm, his gaze steady. He was waiting, not for gratitude, but for her decision. For her to accept the partnership not just in name, but in spirit. "I don't leave because things become complicated," she said softly, repeating the words she had spoken in her old apartment, in what felt like another lifetime. It was a promise. He gave a slow, solemn nod. "Neither do I," he replied. It was his vow in return. There was no dramatic kiss, no passionate embrace. Theirs was not a story of fire, but of quiet, steady gravity, a slow, inevitable alignment of two solitary orbits. He offered his arm, a formal, almost old-fashioned gesture. She took it. His arm was solid and warm beneath the fine wool of his jacket. Together, they turned from the railing and walked back toward the light of the gala. They were not walking into a happily ever after. They were walking into something far more real, more complex, and more beautiful. They were walking into what comes next, a future to be built, a legacy to be forged, a life to be lived. Not in silence and endurance, but in partnership and peace. Hand in hand, they stepped out of the shadows and into their new beginning.